She never told anyone what she used to do. Not the preacher, not the county sheriff, not the three hands she hired after her husband died and left her 60 acres of cracked earth and a herd that was thinning by the season. Not even her daughter, who was 12 years old and already too smart to be lied to. She never told anyone because the people who needed to know she didn't have to tell. They'd find out the hard way, the way men who underestimate quiet women always find out. Her name was Nora Calloway, widow rancher. Owner of the Diamond Sea spread outside Cutter's Bluff, New Mexico Territory, 1884. What the men who rode onto her land that August didn't know, what they couldn't have known, because she had spent 20 years making sure no one knew, was that before she was a wife, before she was a mother, before she was a rancher standing alone in a dead man's boots, Nora Calloway had spent 7 years riding with the U.S. Marshals Scouts. Tracking, reading land, reading men, running down fugitives through mountain passes and desert flats that would kill most soldiers in a week. She had never missed a man she was sent after. 15 men, 15 captures, 11 of them still breathing when she brought them in, which was 4 more than her male counterparts averaged. She quit in 1872, married a good man named Elias Calloway, and buried all of it. Buried the name the Scouts gave her. Buried the letters of commendation from 3 territorial governors. Buried the story she never told her daughter about what it cost a woman to become something no woman was supposed to be. She buried it deep, in the same red earth of this ranch, under 12 years of calves and drought and fence mending and prayers that went unanswered about rain. And then, on a Thursday morning in August, 8 armed men rode through her gate like the past had decided it was done staying buried. They picked the wrong widow. They picked the wrong ranch. They picked the wrong Thursday. What follows is not her account. She never gave one. This is mine. I was there. I saw all of it. And I am still, even now, 3 months later, not entirely sure I survived it the same man I was before. My name is Tobias Greer. I count things when I'm frightened. Always have. I don't know when it started. Fence posts. Boot steps. Breaths. That morning I counted 8 riders coming through the gate, 44 hoofbeats on hardpan, and the number of seconds it took for Nora Calloway to set down her coffee cup, pick up her rifle, and become something I had no name for. They invaded a widow's ranch, unaware she had once tracked and captured men like them. Part 1, the morning they came. I had been working the Diamond Sea for 11 days when they rode in. I want to be clear about who I was before that morning, because who I am now feels like a different man, and I want the seam to be visible. I was a drifter. Not the romantic kind, not the lean, weather-burned cowboy type you read about in the penny papers, the one who rides out of the sunset with a 6-shooter and a philosophy. I was 31 years old. I had $40 to my name. I had a cough that had been following me since Albuquerque, and I was working a widow's ranch for $2 a week and meals, because it was better than sleeping in the arroyo. My name is Tobias Greer. I count things. It's a nervous habit. One of the men I wintered with in El Paso called it strange, and he wasn't wrong. When something goes sideways, when the ground shifts and my brain starts spinning and I can feel my hands wanting to do something useless with themselves, I count. Whatever's in front of me. Fence posts, coffee cups, how many times a horse blinks in a minute. It makes people uncomfortable when they notice. Nora Calloway noticed on my second day and said nothing, which was the reason I liked her. She wasn't an easy woman to like quickly, Nora. She wasn't cold, exactly. She was just contained. Everything about her was pulled in tight, the way you'd pull in a coat against a wind you knew was coming. She was 46, I guessed, though I never asked, because she had the kind of face that made asking feel rude, a face that had done a lot of weather and thought, with eyes the gray-green color of sage after rain. She moved differently than most ranchers I'd worked for. Quieter, more deliberate, not slow, that's not the word, precise. The way she walked through the barn, the way she laid her hand on a horse's neck, the way she stood at the porch rail in the evenings looking out at the flat. Everything had a kind of economy to it, a sense that no movement was wasted. I had noticed it and filed it under ranch widow who's learned to work alone, and let it go at that. I was wrong, but I'll get there. The morning started clean. That's what I keep coming back to when I replay it, how clean and quiet that morning was. The kind of August morning in the high desert where the sky is still lavender at the edges, and the heat hasn't loaded itself into the air yet, and there's a smell to the dry grass that is almost sweet. I was mending the north fence line, the stretch that ran parallel to the road coming in off the main track from Cutter's Bluff. And I had a good angle on the gate, about 200 yards off, and I had counted 17 fence posts between me and it. 17, because I'd started counting when I walked out at dawn, and I couldn't stop until I knew the number, when I heard them. You hear horses before you see them on flat country. The hoofbeats carry differently than any other sound. There's a rhythm to them that the body recognizes before the brain catches up. Something old and primal, that says. Something large is moving toward you. I heard them, and I straightened up from my post hole, and I counted. 8 riders, moving at a steady trot, not galloping, which meant they weren't panicked, and they weren't in a hurry, which meant they thought they had time. When you're in a hurry, you gallop. When you think you already own what's ahead of you, you trot. I watched them come through the gate without stopping. The gate was closed, they didn't stop. The lead rider was a big man, broad in the chest, wearing a duster that had been gray once but had gone the color of old teeth. He had a beard that grew unevenly, higher on one side, and he held his reins in one hand and let the horse do the work while his eyes moved across the ranch in the particular way that men move their eyes across something they're planning to take. I knew that look. I'd seen it on landlords and sheriffs and card players. It was an ownership look, a cataloging look, the look of a man measuring the distance between wanting and having. Behind him, 7 more. Mixed. Young and not young, 2 of them barely old enough to have real beard growth, one of them with a bandage around his left hand going yellow at the edges, one of them with a rifle laid across his saddle pommel, casual, like it was an accident, like he'd just forgotten it was there. Nobody forgets a rifle. I counted them twice. 8 horses, 44 hooves. I counted those 2 when they were close enough, counting each fall separately like a drumbeat. And I stood at my fence line and tried to decide what I was supposed to do with my fence pliers and my bucket of staples, and the fact that my own rifle was back at the barn wall, 170 yards away. Nora was on the porch. She had been sitting on the porch since before I'd come out with her coffee and whatever she did in the mornings that I never intruded on, some combination of looking at the horizon and doing the accounting in her head that kept the ranch from sinking. She stood up when she heard them. I could see her from my angle, small in the distance, the coffee cup still in her left hand, and she stood with that stillness she had, not frozen, not afraid, measuring. The big man in the duster, I'd learned his name was Rigaudon, but I didn't know it then, pulled up in the yard between the house and the barn, and he took off his hat, which was the kind of performance that meant nothing good. Men who genuinely mean to be polite take off their hat as they approach. Men who take their hat off after they've already invaded your yard are performing a courtesy while meaning something entirely different. He said something I couldn't hear from my distance. I started walking. Not running would have given myself away, and I was already doing math in my head. 44 hooves and 8 guns. I assumed 8 guns. 1 per man, probably more than 1 each. And I had my fence pliers and my staples and a clasp knife in my boot and nothing else. I walked at the pace of a man finishing a morning's work, crossing back to the barn for tools. What I heard when I was close enough to hear was Rigaudon's voice, a voice like wagon wheels on gravel, flat and certain in carrying, saying something about the land. Value what you've built here, Mrs. Calloway. That's the honest truth of it, which is why we're coming to you first before any of this gets complicated. Nora set her coffee cup down on the porch railing. She set it down slowly, deliberately, the way she did everything, and she looked at him with those gray-green eyes, and she said, very quietly, I could hear her from 20 feet now because I was moving around the far side of the barn, before it gets complicated. That's right. Tell me what it is. Rigaudon smiled. He had a lot of teeth. This land, this spread, my employers made inquiries with the land office in Santa Fe, and there's some question about the original deed. There's no question about the deed. Some question, he continued, as if she hadn't spoken, about whether the original filing was properly recorded. My employer believes there may be an opportunity to. Who's your employer? He stopped, smiled again. A man named Hollis Crane. He's acquired several neighboring properties this past year, and he. Hollis Crane doesn't exist, Nora said. I had reached the barn wall. I put my hand on it, fingers spread, feeling the weathered wood under my palm, and I counted the horizontal planks from ground to roof. 19. I was listening to every word. There was a silence. The 7 men behind Dunn shifted in their saddles. Not all of them, not the young ones who were watching Dunn for cues. But the older ones shifted, because they'd heard that same flat certainty in a voice before, and it made them cautious in a way they couldn't quite name. "Ma'am," Dunn said, slower now, the pleasant performance dropping about 6 inches. "Holly's Crane is a very real." "Holly's Crane is a name men like you use when they don't want the real name known," Nora said. She stepped down from the porch, 1 step, 2. She stopped at the bottom with her hands loose at her sides. "It's a land grab operation. You buy a name at a county seat somewhere, you hire men who know how to read deeds wrong and write documents that look right, and you use those documents to pressure people off land they legally own. I've seen it done 7 times. Different state, different name, same structure." Dunn stared at her. "The question," Nora said, "is which of the 3 approaches you plan to take. The legal theater approach, where you serve me papers and drag me into court proceedings that cost more than the land is worth. The intimidation approach, which is why you brought 8 men instead of 2, or the 3rd approach." Nobody spoke. "The 3rd approach is when the papers don't matter and the intimidation stops being a performance." She looked at him steadily. "My husband dealt with men using the 3rd approach 12 years ago. He gave them what they wanted, signed the papers, and died 6 months later from a stroke, which I believe was not unrelated to what those men put him through." She paused. "I'm not my husband." I was counting her breaths. 1, 2, I couldn't help it. Dunn's jaw moved. He reset his hat. "Mrs. Calloway, I think you've misunderstood the purpose of—" "You have until sundown," Nora said, "to leave my property. After sundown, I'll interpret your presence as trespass and act accordingly." Dunn looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the 7 men behind him. Then he looked back at her, and the performance was entirely gone now, and what was underneath it was the thing I'd suspected from the moment they'd come through the gate without stopping. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't think you understand who you're talking to." "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Nora said. She turned and walked back up the porch steps and went inside. There was a silence in the yard that lasted, I counted, 11 seconds. Long enough for Dunn to decide what to make of that, and for the men behind him to look at each other, and for me, pressed against the barn wall with my fence pliers in my hand, to understand that we were very far past polite disagreement and deep into something else entirely. Dunn turned in his saddle and looked at the barn, looked at the bunkhouse, looked at the surrounding land with that cataloging gaze again. Then he said, to no one in particular, "Spread out. I want to know what she's working with." They fanned out, and I stood there with my fence pliers and counted to 11 before I remembered how to move. The hands, I should tell you about the hands because it matters. There were 2 others working the diamondsy at that time. A man named Callow, who was Nora's oldest hire, maybe 60, who walked with a knee that had been broken wrong and reset worse, and a boy named Perry, who was 16 and from somewhere in the Arizona territory, and would lie about his age in both directions depending on whether he thought older or younger would serve him better. Callow was out with the herd, maybe 4 miles east, moving a small bunch of yearlings to the second pasture. Perry was supposed to be fixing a broken gate latch on the southeast pen, but Perry at 16 had a talent for being exactly where he was most needed and least expected, which would matter later. I found Callow's extra rifle in the tack room. Springfield old model, one I'd seen him clean on Sunday mornings like a religious practice. 7 rounds in a loop on a leather strip hanging beside it. I took the rifle and the rounds and I stood in the dim of the tack room, and I counted the rounds 6 times before I convinced myself there were definitely 7. Through the tack room's single window, a gap really, boards pulled apart at a knot, I could see one of Dunn's men walking a slow circuit of the barn exterior. Young one with the spotty beard. He had his rifle at his shoulder now, not casual anymore, actually carrying it. He was looking at everything with a deliberateness that told me he'd been told to look for people and assess the defense of the place. Military background, maybe, or hired from someone with one. I counted 5 ways out of the barn. The main door facing the yard, bad option. The tack room window tight, but possible. The loft hatch above the hay dropped to a 12-foot fall, bad idea. The side door opening toward the spotty-bearded man's circuit, terrible. And a gap in the rear wall I'd noticed on my first day because I'm the kind of man who always notices exits and counts them. 5 ways, I fixed on 2. And then Nora came into the barn. She came in through the main door, from the yard in the open, walked through like she owned it, which she did, which was the whole point. She was carrying the rifle I'd seen on her porch wall since my first day, a lever-action Winchester, and she was also carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder that clinked with a weight I recognized. Ammunition, and more of it than I would have guessed she kept close. She saw me in the tack room doorway, and she nodded at the Springfield in my hands. "Callows," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Can you shoot it?" It wasn't a question. She was looking at me with those eyes, and the question was already answered, because she'd watched me work for 11 days, and she had apparently been deciding things about me all that time without telling me. "Yes," I said. "You'll need two," she said. She moved to the loft ladder, checked it, looked up. Then she looked at me again. "How many did you count?" I blinked. 8 riders, Not the riders, the ways out of this barn. I stared at her. She stared back. 5, I said, 2 useful ones. She almost smiled. It was the smallest possible version of a smile, a barely there thing, and it was gone before it fully arrived, but I saw it. "Which 2? I told her. She nodded. "What do you know about holding a position?" she said. "Not much. I know not to fire without knowing what's behind your target." "That's most of it," she said. She put the canvas bag down and opened it. Inside, cartridges more than I could count at a glance. I tried anyway. I got to 30-something before she spoke again. A coil of wire, a knife sheathed in worn leather, a small field telescope collapsed into itself. And this is the thing I kept coming back to, for days after, a worn leather wallet, the kind that folds flat, and from it she drew a card that was yellowed at the edges and said nothing to me except the fact that she had produced it the way you produce something you have kept for a long time. Something whose presence in your pocket is a reminder rather than just an object. She looked at the card for 1 second. Then she put it back. She handed me a box of cartridges and looked at me with the flat, businesslike calm of someone who has had a great number of conversations about very serious things and has learned to strip them to their essentials. "They'll try the house first," she said. "Dunn will try to make me sign something tonight. He'll come with men. When that fails, and it will fail, they'll move to the third option, which means I have until tonight to make this ranch something they don't want to pay the price for." She was right. I knew she was right without knowing how she knew. "There's a girl in the house," I said. "My daughter," she said. "She's not in the house. She's in the root cellar under the kitchen with water, food, a lantern, and my husband's old Colt. She knows how to use it, and she knows not to come out until I come for her myself." I thought about that. I thought about a woman who, the morning 8 armed men rode onto her land, already knew to put her daughter underground with a gun and tell her not to move. "You knew they were coming," I said. "I knew someone was coming," she said. "You don't buy up 6 neighboring properties without an end in mind." "How long have you known?" 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She had known for 3 weeks, and in that 3 weeks she had let me go on mending fence and feeding horses, and assuming I was working for a woman who needed help. "What have you been doing for 3 weeks?" I asked. She looked at me steadily. "Preparing," she said. And I realized, standing in that barn with my borrowed rifle and my 7 counted rounds, that I had absolutely no idea what that meant. Not yet. But I was about to find out. By midday, Dunn's men had settled in a way that told me everything and nothing. 4 had taken positions around the yard, not threatening, not yet, but present, the way a hand laid on a table is present, visible, and weighted. 2 had ridden a circuit of the property, a slow reconnaissance that Nora watched from the kitchen window without expression. The remaining 2, including Dunn himself, had set up near the gate, and Dunn had sent a rider back toward town, which I thought was for reinforcements until I thought about it differently. Not reinforcements, a lawyer, or someone playing one. The papers were coming. That meant Dunn still believed in the legal theater approach, at least for tonight, which meant we had until the papers arrived, until nightfall, probably, before anything changed. I told Nora this. She listened, nodded once, and went back to whatever she was doing at the kitchen table, which I now realized was not accounts. It was a map, hand-drawn on the back of a larger paper in a small, precise hand I now recognized, precise the way everything she did was precise. The ranch, the surrounding terrain, the approach roads, the creek line, the ridge to the north. Distances noted in a shorthand I couldn't read. Positions marked in a code I couldn't read either, but positions I recognized from their placement, as the same positions I would have chosen if I were trying to hold this property against people who knew how to take it. I stood at her shoulder and looked at the map and didn't say anything. She said without looking up, "You're counting the marks." I was 7 marks inside the property, 3 outside it. "What are the outside ones?" I said. She finally looked up at me, and this time she held my gaze for a long moment, and I had the feeling, the overwhelming, almost vertiginous feeling, of having asked a question that was the first real question I'd asked since I arrived, and of the woman across the table deciding in that moment how much of an answer to give me. She gave me all of it. Not the whole story, not then, but enough of it. Enough for me to understand that the woman I had been working for 11 days was not who I had assumed she was. Enough for me to understand that this map was not the first map she had ever drawn. Enough for me to understand, slowly and then all at once, like a picture coming clear from a distance, that Rigaud Dunn and his 8 men had ridden onto this ranch in the same cheerful, ownership-certain trot that I imagined a great many men had used approaching a great many situations, and that every single one of those situations had ended differently than those men planned. Outside in the yard, one of Dunn's riders was whistling something I couldn't identify. Off-key, careless. Nora looked at the map. I counted the marks again. 7 inside, 3 out. "What are the 3 outside ones?" I said again. She pointed to the northernmost mark, outside the fence line up the ridge, and she said one word. "Perry." I stared at the map. I thought of Perry, 16 years old, allegedly fixing a gate latch, supposedly unreliable, definitely impossible to keep track of. "You sent him up there this morning," I said. 3 days ago," she said. I put my hand flat on the table. I counted the grain lines in the wood, 7 of them under my palm. I didn't know what else to do with the number. "All right," I said. "All right," she said. Outside, the whistling stopped. The afternoon was about to get very long. Part 2. They invaded a widow's ranch, unaware she had once tracked and captured men like them. Part 2. What she'd buried in the red earth. The afternoon broke open slow, the way bad weather breaks, not all at once, but in a creeping, darkening sequence where you know what's coming from the first change in the light, but there's nothing to do but watch it arrive. I need to tell you what I learned about Nora Calloway between midday and the fall of dark, because you cannot understand what happened after dark without understanding who she was before she was a widow ranching on 60 acres of dry ground in Cutter's Bluff. And I can only tell you what she told me, in the way she told it in pieces between preparations, while her hands were doing something else, because she was not a woman who told stories the way storytellers tell them. She told them the way you cut fence wire, clipping detail, making connections, with an efficiency that made you do most of the connecting yourself. Here is what I assembled. In 1865, when Nora was 27, younger than I was now standing in her barn, she had been recruited as a scout auxiliary by a man named Captain Aldred Voss, who ran a tracker unit out of the southeastern New Mexico territory for the U.S. Marshal's Office. The unit's function was pursuit, fugitives, stolen livestock operations, the specific kind of organized lawbreaking that regular marshals and their deputies couldn't run down because it required knowing land the way land knows itself. Voss had 3 regular scouts and a rotating group of auxiliaries, and he had a reputation for recruiting outside the expected pool, meaning he recruited anyone who was good at it, regardless of what society thought of their fitness to be good at it. Nora had grown up on land farther south, in the Chilarosa Basin, with a father who tracked game and a mother who had more practical sense than anyone in 3 counties, and she had spent her childhood learning to read terrain the way most children learn to read print. Voss heard about her through a chain of 3 people, tested her on a 2-day ride through country that had broken experienced men, and offered her a contract on the spot. She said yes. She was 27 and her first husband, a good man different from Elia's, also named in her voice as good, had died of fever the previous winter, and she was alone on land she couldn't work alone, and she said yes. 7 years. 7 years riding with Voss's unit, 15 tracked fugitives. The number I already knew from the card in the leather wallet. The card was, she told me without ceremony, a letter of commendation written by Governor Giddings of New Mexico Territory in 1870, folded flat and kept not out of pride, but out of some other impulse she didn't name, but which I recognized as the impulse to keep the evidence that something happened, when you're not sure anyone else will believe it did. 15, I said. 15. 11 alive. She looked at me sideways. You're making a judgment. I'm not. 11 alive is a higher percentage than any man in that unit brought in. She said it flat, without heat. The 4 who didn't come in alive had made that choice themselves. I gave each of them the same option. I believed her. I don't know why exactly, except that everything else she had told me had been exactly as stated. No embellishment, no editorializing. And she had that quality that very few people have, the quality of someone who has no stake in making themselves sound good, only in being accurately understood. Why'd you stop? I said. She was quiet for a moment. We were in the kitchen. She was doing something with a length of wire and a pair of pliers with a care that I now recognized as not a general but a specific kind of care, and she set the wire down before she answered. I got shot, she said. She said it the way you'd say I caught a cold. Matter of fact, a thing that happened and its consequences. It healed wrong left shoulder. She moved the shoulder slightly, a minimal shrug. I can still do everything I need to do, but I can't hold a draw position for more than 30 seconds before it starts to shake. Used to be I could hold a position for 2 minutes. You lose 2 minutes, you lose a lot of options. That's why the rifle over the pistol. She nodded. And Voss died of a heart episode in 1875. Unit dissolved. Did anyone know what you'd done? Voss knew, the men in the unit knew, 3 governors knew. She picked up the wire again. My husband Elias knew. He thought it was the most remarkable thing he'd ever heard when I told him. He used to joke that I'd married beneath my reputation. A pause, very small. He was probably right. She said it without looking at me, and I said nothing, because what do you say to that? To the plain sentence of a woman who has buried both a history and a man she loved and kept going because the alternative was not going, and that was not something she was built for. Outside, the light was moving. The long afternoon shadows were stretching, beginning their tilt toward evening. The 3 outside marks, I said. Perry on the ridge, who else? Callow came back from the east pasture at noon. She was watching the wire. He's in the old dry gulch south of the property. You can't see it from the road, but you can see the road from it. I thought about Callow, with his bad knee, and his Sunday morning rifle cleaning. I thought about the way he moved through the barn, deliberate, unhurried, with a quality that I now understood was not age but economy. The same economy as Nora. Not a coincidence, I realized. When you work for someone long enough, you absorb their way of moving through the world. 3rd mark. She set the wire down again. This time she turned to face me fully, and her eyes in the late afternoon light had a color I'd been trying to name since my first day, not quite gray, not quite green, exactly the color of water over limestone in desert country. There's a man named Luther Ashe who operates out of the Mesa country north of the Jicarilla Range, she said. He's been an ally of mine for 11 years. When I knew someone was coming, I sent him a letter. I waited. He'll come if he can, she said. He may not be able to. His situation is complicated by, she paused, choosing, by the fact that the law and Luther Ashe have an ambiguous relationship. An outlaw. A man who makes choices that have put him outside the law's comfort. Not a violent man, a practical one. She held my gaze. I don't apologize for the friendship. I'm not asking you to. She studied me a moment, deciding something. You're not frightened, she said. It was an observation, not a compliment. I thought about that honestly. I'm frightened, I said. I've been counting things since this morning. That's what I do when I'm frightened. I know, she turned back to the wire. You're frightened and you're still here. That's more useful than not frightened. I counted the nails in the kitchen floorboards. Somewhere between 12 and 19. I lost count at the door. Dunn came to the house at 4 o'clock. He came alone, which I had not expected. He walked up the porch steps with his hat in his hands and knocked like a man calling on a neighbor, and Nora opened the door and stood in it and looked at him. Mrs. Calloway, I wonder if we might talk more privately. You're welcome to say what you have to say from there. He glanced past her into the house, a quick involuntary flick of the eyes, looking for who else was inside. He found me, standing back from the door. and he looked at me with an assessment that took about 2 seconds, and arrived at the conclusion that I was a hired hand and therefore not a complicating factor. That's a decision that was going to cost him. "A man's coming from town with documents," Dunn said. "Official documents, Mrs. Calloway. They'll demonstrate clearly that the original deed on this property was filed incorrectly, missing a witness signature required by territorial law. Without that signature, the filing is invalid, and the land reverts to territorial trust, which my employer has filed to acquire." Nora said, "Is that right?" "It is." "What's the witness signature you're saying is missing?" Dunn reached into his coat. He produced a paper. I couldn't see it clearly, but the quality of his hold on it told me everything. He held it like a man holding something he knows is a prop, not evidence. The slight, over-careful grip. The angle turned slightly away from the best light. The original filing shows a signature from one Marcus Holt, listed as witness. However, we have an affidavit from Mr. Holt's widow stating that he was not present at the filing and did not sign. "Marcus Holt's widow," Nora said. "That's right. Margaret Holt." Dunn blinked. Yes, Margaret Holt." "Margaret Holt has been living in Tucson for 6 years. She does not read, which makes the affidavit she supposedly signed interesting." Nora looked at the paper. "Marcus Holt, who is also her husband, whose name is also interesting, because the man who witnessed my deed filing was Marcus Holt, Holt, who is very much alive and operates a dry goods store in Mesilla, and who I contacted 3 weeks ago asking him to keep the original signed copy of that filing in his safe, which he has done." Dunn's hands tightened slightly on the hat he was holding. "The affidavit you're holding," Nora continued, "was manufactured, probably by someone in Santa Fe who knew where to get a credible forgery. I'd guess it cost about $40, which is what that level of forgery usually runs. You might want to know, for the future, that territorial land office forgeries are a federal crime carrying a sentence of 7 to 15 years. Dunn stood very still. "I'm not threatening you," Nora said. "I'm informing you there's a difference." He stared at her. I watched his face do something complicated, a sequence of calculations arriving at a conclusion he didn't like, because the conclusion was that the theater approach was done, and he had known it might not work, and now he had to move to the next approach, and he had enough intelligence to understand that the woman in this doorway was not the kind of woman the next approach was going to resolve easily. "Mrs. Calloway," he said very quietly, "I'm going to ask you one more time to consider accepting a fair settlement for this property, for your daughter's sake and your own. My employer is willing to—" "My daughter," Nora said, and her voice dropped about 10 degrees, not in volume but in temperature, and I felt it from where I stood, "is not a negotiating point." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has a weight. Dunn put his hat on. He walked down the porch steps. He did not turn around. When he reached his horse and swung up, he said to no one visible, to the yard, to the air, "Tonight, then." He rode back to the gate. Nora closed the door. She stood with her back to it for one moment, just 3 seconds at most, and in that 3 seconds I saw something I had not seen in her face before. Not fear, something older and heavier than fear. The expression of a person who has been hoping a thing would not go a certain way, who now knows it is going exactly that way, and who is making the internal translation from hope to acceptance. Then it was gone. "All right," she said. She picked up the canvas bag. 3 hours of daylight, let's use them." Those 3 hours were the most instructive of my life. I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I had been alive for 31 years, and in those 31 years I had learned things from men who were good at them. Fence mending, horse breaking, reading weather. But I had never been in the presence of someone who was systematically good at everything required to make a position defensible. And watching Nora work those 3 hours was like watching a person think in a language I'd never heard but could almost understand. She worked the terrain around the barn and the house in a grid. Not a random walk, a grid, which told me she'd already done this in her head and was now executing a plan she'd made days ago. She placed things. I helped her place them. Some I understood immediately. A rope strung low between 2 fence posts at the dark end of the yard where a man moving fast and unwary would catch it at shin level. A lantern positioned inside the barn, on a shelf, angled to throw light in one direction while leaving the approaches dark. The wire she'd been working, now I saw its purpose. fixed to two posts with a kind of tension that meant touching it would drop a hanging bar of metal against the barn wall and make a sound like a hammer strike. Not a trap, not a weapon. An alarm, 3 of them around the property's perimeter. Some things I didn't understand and didn't ask about. There was a length of time she spent at the north end of the property, near the fence line, doing something with the earth itself, moving it, tamping it, covering it. I stood back and let her work, and when she came back, she had red dust on both hands and a look in her eyes that was focused on something 3 steps ahead of the present, and I didn't ask. And somewhere in the middle of hour 2, as the light was going gold and long, Perry appeared. He came from the north, which meant he'd come down from the ridge, come down without me hearing him, which is a thing I will not easily explain because I was paying attention to sound. He just appeared at Nora's elbow like a thing that had been there for a while, and I'd only just noticed it. 16 years old, rail-thin, with the telescope I now recognized from Nora's canvas bag folded in his shirt pocket. 7 now, he said. One of 'em rode back toward town, left the bandaged one at the gate. Direction, Nora said. South Road, moving like a man with a schedule. The lawyer, she nodded. What's their spread? Gate man, 2 in the east, 1 behind the bunkhouse, 2 at the road turnoff. Dunn's at the gate with the bandage man. She nodded again. She told Perry where she needed him, and he listened with the flat, information-absorbing attention of a person who has been told important things before and knows the difference between listening and just hearing. He asked 2 questions, both tactical, and then he went where she told him. I watched him go and I thought, she's been training him, not just putting him to work, training him. And I thought about the 3 weeks she'd had and the map on the table and the fact that she'd known something was coming, and I understood that in those 3 weeks she had taken the people around her and quietly, without fanfare, converted them into something that was not a ranch crew but was something else. Something with an older name. You're worried, Nora said. She was watching the horizon now, the light going apricot, and then a deep orange that lay flat on the scrub and made the whole landscape look like the inside of something burning. I'm counting, I said. What? The stars, first ones are coming up. She looked at the sky, then at me, then at the stars. There'll be more before this is over, she said. I looked at the sky. I counted 7 stars, then 8. Then more than I could count, and I couldn't stop trying, and she stood beside me for a moment, 30 seconds, maybe 40, and neither of us spoke. Then she said, Callow knows where to be. Perry knows where to be. You know where to be. Yes. They'll come after midnight. Dunn likes the small hours, you can see it in the way he's positioned his men. Not tonight at dark and not at dawn, 2, 3 o'clock, when the body's lowest. You've tracked men like him before. I've tracked men, she said. Men have patterns, even the ones who think they don't. The last orange light was thinning at the horizon's edge. The desert was going silver and blue. Somewhere out in the dark, the first cricket of the evening started up, then stopped, then started again. Mrs. Calloway, I said. Nora, I counted 6 seconds before I said the next thing. Those 15 men you tracked, were you frightened then? She considered this genuinely. Not performing consideration, actually thinking about it. Every time, she said, until the moment I needed to stop being frightened, and then I stopped. How'd you do that? She was quiet. I don't know, she said at last. I never found out how I did it, it just happened. The fear was there, and then it wasn't, and I was moving, and my hands were steady. She looked at her hands, both of them flat for a moment against her thighs. The shoulder shakes after 30 seconds, she said. But the hands are steady. I thought that was the end of it, but after a pause she said something else, quietly looking at the first stars. Elias asked me once, she said, if I ever regretted stopping the scouts, the work. She paused. I told him no, and I meant it mostly. She stopped again. Mostly. I didn't ask about the rest of it. I counted the cricket sounds, trying to anyway. There were too many now, coming from everywhere in the dark, and I stood beside her until she turned and walked back to the house. Dunn's men were 4 hours away. The stars kept coming. They invaded a widow's ranch, unaware she had once tracked and captured men like them. Part 3, what the morning found. At 1:47 in the morning, the wire at the north end of the barn struck the metal bar, and the sound hit the night like a hammer on an anvil. I had been awake. I had not thought I could sleep, and so I had not tried to. and I had spent the hours between dark and the wire alarm in the tack room with Callow's Springfield across my knees, counting things in the dark. The sound of the wind through the barn planks, 19 distinct pitches, which I ranked and re-ranked. The number of times an owl called from the cottonwood near the creek, 31, then silence. The number of breaths I took per minute, 14, 13 when I tried to slow down. 16 when I stopped trying. And when the wire hit the bar, I stopped counting everything, and my hands, without consultation from the rest of me, brought the Springfield up level. Nora had been right about the hour. I hadn't doubted her, but being right about the hour, the specific, small hour's wait of 1:47, when the body is most convinced the world has stopped, was the kind of right that is different from general rightness. It was the kind of right that comes from having read something enough times to recognize it even in the dark. I heard them before I saw them. 3 from the north, that was the wire they'd tripped, moving through the dark past the fence line toward the barn. 2 more from the east, which I could tell by the sound pattern of their boots on the hardpan, different from the northerners by maybe 8 seconds in timing, which meant 2 separate signals given to 2 separate groups, a coordinated approach. And from the south, from the bunkhouse direction, where I couldn't see sounds I couldn't count clearly, which was the worst of it, because not knowing the number is worse than knowing a bad number. I counted what I could, 3 north, 2 east, unknown south. That left Dunn himself, and Dunn I could not place. I moved to the tack room window, the gap in the boards, and put my eye to it and let my vision adjust to the moonlit yard. The moon was 3/4 full and high, which was good and bad. Good because I could see, bad because they could see. The yard had the flat silver quality that high desert moonlight has, everything sharp-edged and shadowless, every movement visible, every position exposed. The 4-foot stretch of rope strung low between the 2 fence posts at the dark end of the yard was invisible in this light, which was all that mattered about it. I waited. The first sound from inside the barn was small, a boot sole on dirt. One of the north 3 had come in through the main door, which meant they'd approached from an angle I hadn't expected, and I felt the cold spike of that miscalculation hit me in the chest. I had been watching the main door from the tack room. I had been watching the wrong angle. I moved, tack room door flat against the wall beside it, Springfield up. The interior of the barn was dark, but the main door was open and the moonlight came through it in a shaft, and in that shaft I could see a man-shaped darkness moving careful and low. I'm going to be truthful about the next 30 seconds. I do not know exactly what I did in what order. I know what happened. I know the sequence of events. But inside those 30 seconds, my mind was doing something that it had never done before, something that felt like counting, but faster, much faster, not numbers, but positions and movements and sightlines. Clicking through them the way my fingers usually clicked through fence posts, with the same compulsive automatic speed. I know that I pressed myself flatter against the wall, and let the first man fully enter the barn before I moved. I know that when he was inside and his eyes were adjusting, and his rifle was forward pointed at the empty tack room door, I stepped into the shaft of moonlight and said, in the loudest voice I owned, "Don't." I know he turned. I know I said "don't" again, which is 2 words total, and neither of them is particularly eloquent, but they were the 2 words I had available. He didn't. He stood very still, which was the right choice, and I was aware from the corner of my vision that 2 more shapes were filling the doorframe behind him, the north 3 all now inside, and my count of visible threats had just become 3, and my available rifle rounds was 7, and the math of that was not comfortable. And then the wire at the east end of the barn struck. The sound hit the same way as the first one, the sudden clang of metal on metal in the dark, and the 2 men in the doorframe turned to look toward it, and in that turning I heard what had been waiting behind the stillness of the last 4 hours. A sound from the direction of the yard, clear even through the barn walls. A voice that was not loud but was precise and carrying the way voices carry in still night air. Nora's voice. Drop them. 2 words. No explanation, no threat, no performance. 2 words in the particular register of someone who has said 2 words exactly like them a great number of times to a great number of people, and has always meant them, and has always been right to mean them. I heard one rifle hit the ground outside. Then another's. I said to the 3 men inside the barn, "You heard her." The first man, the one I'd stopped in the shaft of moonlight, looked at me. He was young. I could see that in the moonlight, the edge of his face, the no-quite-grown quality of his features. Young enough that what I saw in his expression when he looked at me was not defiance but something much simpler and more devastating. He was relieved. He was relieved to have been stopped. He set the rifle down. Outside was more complicated. I want to give you the whole picture, as best I've assembled it, because I only saw pieces of it at the time, and the rest I reconstructed from what Nora told me in the days after, and what Callow told me, and what Perry told me in the particular flat, detail-perfect way Perry narrated events, as if he were reading from a report he'd written in his head. What happened in the yard in those same 30 seconds, I was inside the barn, was this. The two Eastern men, coming around the far side of the barn toward the house, ran into the low rope. Not one of them, both. The first hit it at shin level and went down on his hands, and the second tripped over the first before he'd registered the rope, and they were both down in the dirt, and the noise of it was significant. Callow was behind the water trough, 14 feet from where they fell. He did not shoot. He stepped out from behind the trough into the moonlight with his rifle and said what I imagine was similar to what I said, or what Nora said, which was some short configuration of words meaning stay down. The two men stayed down. The two at the south, the bunkhouse direction, were the ones I hadn't been able to count. What I learned later was that there were not two of them. There were two sound signatures, but one of them was Perry, who had made his way from the ridge to the bunkhouse roof sometime after midnight and had been lying flat on it since then. When the south men moved, Perry did something I would not have thought of. He made a sound. A specific sound, the pump of a shotgun, which is one of the most immediately recognizable sounds a human ear can register in the dark. He didn't have a shotgun. He had a piece of barrel from a broken piece of equipment that he'd found in the barn 2 days ago, and he pumped it in his hands in the dark, and the man approaching the bunkhouse stopped exactly where he was. There was no shotgun. Perry told me this with a straight face and the satisfied expression of a person who has solved a problem in an unconventional way and is aware that the solution was good. And Dunn was the one I hadn't been able to place. Dunn was at the house. He'd separated from his men and come alone to the front door, which was, when I thought about it afterward, a version of what he'd done that afternoon, come alone to the porch without the theater this time, without the Hat in Hands performance. Just alone in the dark at the door. What he intended, I don't know. Harm, papers. A private conversation with a woman he'd underestimated all day and was still, perhaps, underestimating. What he found at the door was Nora. She opened it before he knocked. She opened it and stood in it with the Winchester and looked at him. He had a gun in his hand. He was looking at her and his gun was in his hand, and she was looking at him with those gray-green eyes and the Winchester leveled. And I don't know what he was reading in her face because I wasn't there. I was 40 yards away, inside the barn, but Perry described it to me from his angle on the bunkhouse roof. He said she looked at him like she already knew what he was going to decide, like she'd already figured it out and she was just waiting for him to catch up. Dunn's gun arm dropped. It dropped by degrees, not a sudden decision, but a slow one, a mechanical unwinding, like a thing that had been wound too tight for too long and was finally releasing. His arm went to his side. The gun stayed in his hand, pointed at the ground. He said something to her. Perry couldn't hear it. She said something back, short. Perry couldn't hear that either. Dunn sat down on the porch steps. He sat down on the porch, steps the way a man sits when the weight of something has finally transferred from his legs to the ground, and he put the gun down beside him, and he sat there. 14 men in the end. Dunn had brought 3 extra who'd been waiting on the road half a mile from the property, insurance he hadn't announced. We found them when Callow rode out at false dawn, and they were exactly where Callow had expected them to be, because Callow had worked for Nora long enough to know how to read a probable extra position, and they came in without incident, which I mean in the literal sense that nothing further happened, which I was grateful for. 14 men. 2 rifles Nora had on her own account that morning, Callow's Springfield, Perry's imaginary shotgun. A length of wire and a rope, and a position prepared over 3 weeks by a woman who had once tracked men through mountain passes, and who had, at some point in those 3 weeks, accepted that the thing she'd buried was going to have to be dug up. I counted them as they sat in the yard at first light. 14 men, some of them young enough to be embarrassed by the night's events, some of them old enough to be quietly furious. One of them, Dunn, sitting slightly apart from the others with the expression of a man reviewing something he can't revise. We waited for the sheriff from Cutter's Bluff, who arrived at mid-morning. His name was Travers, and he was a man in his 50s with the deliberate, unhurried manner of a sheriff who has operated in country that punishes haste. And he took in the 14 men in the yard and the woman on the porch, and he looked at her for a long time before he looked at anything else. Then he took off his hat, genuinely this time the real kind. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I'll need an account." "You'll have it," she said. She gave it to him in 20 minutes, standing on the porch in the morning light with her arms crossed and her voice flat and precise. And Sheriff Travers wrote in his book and nodded and occasionally asked a question that she answered fully, and he did not once, in 20 minutes, suggest that she had done anything that required his correction. Whether that was because she genuinely hadn't, or because something in her bearing convinced him not to, I couldn't say. He took the 14 men, loaded them into 2 wagons, and rode south toward Cutter's Bluff with them, and the yard was empty by noon. I found Nora in the afternoon at the place in the north fence line where I'd been mending posts on the morning they came in. She was standing at the fence, not working it, just standing, looking east across the flats. She'd brought her daughter out of the root cellar that morning, first thing, before Travers arrived. I'd watched it from a distance, watched Nora go down the 3 steps into the earth and come back up with a girl who was 12 years old and had been underground all night with a lantern and a colt, and who came out squinting at the light and then looked at the yard full of men sitting in the dirt and at her mother's face, and who said, I was close enough to hear, "Did you get them all?" Nora had said yes. The girl had nodded, like this was expected, like she had calculated the likely outcomes and found this one correct. Now she was in the house, and Nora was at the fence. I walked up beside her, and we stood there for a while without talking. The flats were all umber and gold in the afternoon light, and the heat pressed down with the comfortable weight of a thing that means nothing personal. And somewhere out there the yearlings that Callow had been moving were still moving, or standing in the second pasture, or doing whatever yearlings do on the afternoon after the night the ranch defended itself. "Are you all right?" I said. "Yes," she said, then a second later, "I'm not sure." I nodded. "The young one," she said. "In the barns." "He was relieved," she said. "When it stopped, you could see it." "Yes." She looked at the flats. "That's the hardest part," she said. "It was always the hardest part. When you can see that a man is in something he didn't fully choose and doesn't fully understand and can't see his way out of, and you're the one who has to provide the way out, even if the way out looks like a rifle." She paused. I never found a good way to feel about that. I counted the fence posts between us and the horizon, gave up at 30. "The 4th one," she said, "of the 15. I waited. He was 20 years old. He'd been riding with a man for 18 months, doing things he thought he had to do to survive, and by the time I tracked them down he'd forgotten there was a way to stop. She was not looking at me. Her voice was even and careful. "I brought him in. He served his time. I heard years later he'd settled in Dona County with a wife and a piece of land." "Did that help?" I said. A pause. The wind moved through the grass with a dry, papery sound. "Some," she said. I thought about the young man in the barn. I thought about his relieved face in the moonlight. I thought about the accounting of these things, what you carry out of a night like this, what you set down, what you can't. "What's the card?" I said. "The one in the leather wallet." She looked at me. "The commendation from Governor Giddings," she said. "Why do you keep it?" She was quiet for what felt like a long time, long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. "To remind myself," she said at last, "that there was someone who believed the work was worth doing. Even when I wasn't sure." The light shifted. It does that in the late afternoon in that country, not gradually, not by degrees, but in sudden pivots, the whole landscape going a different register of gold without transition, like a page turning. "Tobias," she said. "Yes. Are you staying?" I thought about the $40, the cough that was still following me from Albuquerque, the string of ranches I'd worked across the territory, each one a stopping place, not a destination. "I was thinking about it," I said. "I need the north fence finished," she said. "I know." She walked back toward the house. Halfway there she stopped. She didn't turn around. She stood with her back to me for a moment, and I could see the bad shoulder, the left one, the one that shook after 30 seconds. I could see it in the set of her back, the slight compensation she made always in the way she carried herself. Then she kept walking. I never counted the remaining posts in the north fence line. That bothered me for about 2 days, and then it stopped bothering me, and I'm not sure what to make of that, except that maybe some numbers don't need finishing. The young man from the barn, his name was Everett, which I learned from the court proceedings that followed, which Nora attended in Cutter's Bluff 6 weeks later with her daughter beside her, and her hat level, was given a 3-year sentence. He shook Nora's hand outside the courthouse after the sentencing, which I watched from 12 feet away and which I am still not able to fully describe. The thing that passed between them in that handshake, except to say that it was real, whatever it was. Dunn got 7 years for the forgery alone. There were other charges. I stopped keeping track. Holly's Crane, the real one, the actual man behind the invented employer name, was a man named Bertram Lacey, who operated out of Las Cruces and had acquired 11 properties in the same manner over 3 years. He was arrested 6 weeks after the night at the Diamond Sea. I don't know if Nora's account to Sheriff Travers had anything to do with that. I have a suspicion, which I keep to myself. Luther Ashe never came. I asked Nora about it once. She said she'd gotten a letter, that his situation had been what it was. She didn't explain further. Whatever Luther Ashe was to her, what 11 years of alliance in complicated country made 2 people. She kept it in the same place she kept everything, folded flat and pressed close. She told her daughter the truth in November. I wasn't there. I know it happened because afterward the girl, her name was Clara, which I should have told you sooner and didn't came and found me at the barn and sat on the fence rail and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Did you know about what she used to do?" "Not until the day they came," I said. Clara thought about this. She had her mother's eyes, the same color, the same quality of measuring things carefully before deciding. She said, Clara started, stopped. She said the work changed her. She said she didn't always like what it changed her into. A pause. But she said it also, she said. She stopped again. I waited. She said it taught her that she was enough, Clara said. That's what she said, that she was enough. I looked at the north fence line, where I had finally finished the posts. I didn't count them. Clara stayed on the fence rail until the evening light started going, and then she went inside, and I stayed until the stars came out. I counted 7 before I stopped.